of the two facets of this plan.
Okay, so yeah, I'm going to just outline the two main facets of this plan. The first aims to distribute at least one social worker into every public school in order to provide a more emotionally safe environment. And the second part serves to forge connections while also mutually benefiting adolescent students of varying ages through a peer-to-peer mentorship program.
So first, we're going to tell you about what the issue is, what is the school to prison pipeline, and how are social workers involved. Then we're going to talk to you about the solution, or at least what we think the solution is. Then we're going to talk to you about extra solutions, which is our mentorship program. And then we're going to tell you all how to pay for it and how we can pay for it as a community.
All right, so the school to prison pipeline is basically when young students they have disadvantages and they become incarcerated based on like harsh schooling and the policies they can't follow. The this like mostly affects children like who get suspended, people of color, and those who have disabilities. You know, and the school to prison pipeline also affect those students who aren't interacted between the hours after 3 o'clock, which are school hours. These are because they don't have the activities and stuff to do, so they get into trouble, which leads them to the prison system, and that's how like the school to prison pipeline, connects.
And we believe the way to fix it is by increased access to social workers in public schools. There are 671 New York City public schools that currently don't have access to a social worker. And in schools that recently got a social worker present in their school, the rate of people moving on to the next grade level who are at-risk youth increased by 98%, and English and math proficiency scores also increased by around 94%.
So here's some information about who the school to prison pipeline most directly affects. So students most likely to be arrested for in-school incidents are minority students, and specifically English language learners, students with insecure housing, and students with an individual education plan. An IEP is a plan for students with behavioral challenges and/or learning disabilities. Additionally, there are 80,000 people between the ages of 18 and 24 who do not have a high school diploma, and this directly correlates with the age range of people most likely to commit violent crimes.
So we believe that better equipped social workers in underserved public middle and high schools will contribute to higher graduation rates, improved mental health, and as a result, lower incarceration rates. Because if a student is in school and they're learning, that's really great. But the problem is they don't have an emotional safe space to be able to communicate with an adult about what they think their needs are. And if they don't have access to that space, all of those pent-up emotions are going to translate into not knowing what to do with oneself, which can lead to increased rates of violence and crime. And people don't feel that they can connect with police officers in their school on an emotional level. So that's really why we need social workers to be there as a resource for students to connect with.
Okay, so in order to define the problem, we first need to understand some of the key terms and the differences between them. So first, there are two different kinds of stress that we're going to be talking about. The first being chronic stress, the type that hurts psychological development and school performance. And then that can transition into toxic stress, which is the type of stress that leads to physical aggression, thus increasing the rates of arrest. Then also sometimes there's confusion between the definition of a social worker and that of a counselor, so I'll just quickly outline that. Social workers provide advice, support, and resources to individuals and their families, whereas counselors are people trained to give guidance on personal, social, or psychological problems.
So Margaret Crotty, the head of Partnership for Children, described the dire issue of the school to prison pipeline. She claimed, "An invisible threat is clouding the future of the 73% of New York City public school children growing up in poverty, and represents one of the greatest public health challenges of our time. This is the impact of chronic stress. Imagine not knowing where you'll sleep, what you will eat, or how your life will change tomorrow."
All right. So decrease in incarceration rates, increase access to counselors, increases graduation rates, and decreases incarceration rates. Now, increasing graduation rates, schools with better equipped social workers have more at-risk students move on to the next grade. So like students who have more access to social workers are more likely, to be moved to like a higher grade, and higher salaries earned by high school and later college graduates generates heightened tax revenue. Also, less money is spent on inmates.
Okay. So to numerically illustrate the vital need for social workers and a mentorship program, we found some compelling statistics. The first is that 14 million students attend a school with a police presence, but no counselor and or nurse. Also, 44% of New York City public schools do not have a social worker. 98% of schools that partnered with Partnership for Children, which is a private mentorship program option, had their highest need students move on to the next grade level. And then we also found a comparison in terms of ratios of the national average ratio of social workers to students, which is 1 to 250, versus the ratio of social workers to public school students in New York City, which is 1 to 716.
So in order to fully examine the issue we're attempting to address, we want to delineate exactly what it is and who it affects. So the issue is the heightened police presence at underserved schools with predominantly minority students, creating a sense of combativeness and uneasiness between students and law enforcement. At many of these schools, the police presence is in place of social workers, and the affected population is the students in these underserved schools who are mostly students of color and other minorities. Since we are advocating for social workers because of the confidentiality and trusting bonds they can form with students, we want to go over New York State's regulations regarding social work confidentiality. So New York State guarantees complete confidentiality with 4 exceptions. The first is if the student gave consent to share specific information with a specific person. The second is if the student reveals that they have committed or are considering committing a harmful act to themselves or to others. The third is if a student under 16 years old reveals that they've been the victim of a crime. And the last one is if a student charges or sues the social worker and the case requires confidential information as evidence. So now, understanding social workers' confidentiality capabilities, we want to really spell out why we decided to center our plan around them. We believe that social workers can provide safe spaces for students to build an emotional connection. In addition, there's an important distinction that Taja made earlier, which is that social workers, as opposed to counselors, can provide resources to individual families. We believe that this is a significant pro for social workers and how they can help students in underserved schools. Contrastingly, the current law enforcement presence in these schools makes students feel unsafe and targeted. Since law enforcement's job is to enforce laws and punish those who break them, of course students would feel uncomfortable truthfully opening up to them.
All right, now the process of our proposal is basically step one, which is to sit down with the Department of Social Services and social work organizations to hear about their needs. Step two, select a few schools to run a pilot program. Step three, which would be to expand the program to more schools. And last but not least, stay in communication with the schools about their continued needs and student performance.
So I'm going to talk to you about how to fund our plan. Our plan costs $39.1 million. And yes, that sounds expensive, but a plan is nothing without a way to pay for it. To combat the notion that our proposal is too expensive, I would tell you that New York State spends $21 billion on incarcerated young adults annually. This means that with an average salary of $58,386 per year, it would take 538 years for our plan to equal the cost of just 1 year of paying for incarcerated young adults. Specifics. Public schools are funded by public tax income. However, the Department of Social Services oversees social workers. The Department of Social Services is funded by federal grants, city funds, and state funds. There are 3 federal grants that make up 15.9% of DSS funding. However, none of them directly have to do with social workers in public schools. They're all about assisting families. The state funds make up 7.2 of the Department of Social Services budget, 7.2%, apology, of the Department of Social Services budget, and the city funds account for 76.8% of the budget. So, to fund our new program, we would encourage divestment from the NYPD because many organizations have already been defunded. However, the NYPD tends to avoid significant budget cuts. We would also incentivize private donations by creating a list of New York Friends of Education to be published on the DOE and DSS websites. This is styled after the Central Park Conservatory putting donors' names on park benches. It would be similar to that strategy, however, it would be a virtual system for the Department of Education and Department of Social Services. We would also request increased funding from the Social Services Block Grant, SSBG, which is a federal grant, and we would also ask that to commute the sentences of first-time nonviolent young adult offenders. New York spends $352,663 on one incarcerated young adult per year. That's the highest in the nation. In contrast, the state only spends $18,500 on each student. The point we're trying to make with these numbers is that locking up a student also incarcerates their mind. If you buy into this program, increased access to social workers increases graduation rates of high schools. High school graduates and college graduates earn significantly more money than students who drop out of high school. Also, in better school districts, property taxes go up because more people are going to want to live in areas with better public schools. So that generates increased revenue for the city, and there's going to be increased tax revenue because graduates are going to be paying more taxes. We would also promote a public-private partnership between the Department of Social Services and organizations like Partnership for Children and Partnership for Children, because we believe that if our program isn't able to get fully funded by government sources, there are lots of organizations that will be willing to help us achieve our goal of putting a social worker in each one of the 671 remaining public schools in New York.
Okay. So additionally, we wanted to provide our idea of a mentorship program that could be implemented within schools, a replicable structure. And I'll just outline that real quick. Basically, it would pair seniors and sophomores or juniors and freshmen, or pair high schoolers and middle schoolers if there's some kind of inter-school relationship, and then conduct a survey or application to pair students with similar identifiers and complementary personalities. And we believe there is a possibility for immense benefits, including increasing confidence in developing skills or a sense of community with the students.
Lastly, we just want to stress that our recommendation would not just be an investment in social workers because of the multiplier effect. So social workers would be adding their counseling expertise to the schools. However, they would also have a hand in training the mentors in our Bridge the Gap program. This way, we would be developing an entire generation of students who care deeply about and are capable of counseling. And we just want to stress that social workers are essential personnel, especially in this time of crisis when our generation is facing irreversible trauma. Mental health should be as prioritized as physical health. So that's our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all for listening. And does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, I was just about to say, we have like 10 minutes-ish for Q&A, so everybody can like type their questions to the chat or something like that.
Okay. You can unmute yourself and ask a question.
Yeah, anybody can ask. You don't have to.
Okay. Mr. Frizz?
Hi, everyone. I'm Lucy from the Institute for Innovation and Prosecution, and I'm so proud and impressed by the work that you've put into this. I guess you don't want me to give commentary now or responses right at this stage?
No, yes.
Questions?
You can ask questions, yeah, and we'll answer.
Just questions, okay. So I really think you did a terrific job overall. I guess I sort of want to know why this issue for you all. I mean, I'm persuaded of it at the macro level, but aside from the fact that you're students and it's relevant to schools, what was it that compelled this group to take on this particularly challenging issue?
So I would say that the mental health crisis in this country has really affected so many of us personally. On a personal level, for me, this year, I lost one of my closest friends to suicide. And to kind of experience that, but also recognize my privilege and have access to such a great resource at my school and have people to talk to was something that was really able to kind of get me through that time period. And it was actually my chemistry teacher who came up to me in school and asked, "How did you miss all the signs?" So to hear somebody completely not understand what goes on in the mind of a teenager when they lose someone really close to them is super, super dangerous. And it made me feel like a bad person. It made me feel like I was responsible for the loss of my friend. So I was lucky enough to have a really great person at my school that I was able to talk to. But as we mentioned, there are 14 million New York students that aren't able to have somebody to talk to if something like this, God forbid, ever happens to them. So there's such a personal connection to the mental health crisis in this country that we felt like we had to take on a presentation like this.
And especially like during this time, during this pandemic, a lot of students, have gone through like anxiety, struggling with the transition between, being in a class to virtual and online is really challenging. Me, at my school, I'm the current student body president, so like I've been trying to, organize Zooms and like other communicational ways for students to feel comfortable in work with administration, which has been successfully. I believe that every student should have an outlet, a mentor or teacher like Asher or like any of us to go to person so that we can talk to, and it's really important, especially for like seniors and stuff like that, the transition from being a high school student to a freshman college, it's really important to have that guidance and mentorship so that you won't fall through the cracks. The reason, these students are falling through the cracks is because they don't have the outlets and resources, to help them get where they need to be and move on to the next level. So yeah, Taji, you can.
Yeah, and I also think just more broadly, youth is a really important time developmentally for kids, and sometimes I think very oftentimes the punishment for mistakes we all inevitably make is very unjust and it's very disproportionate. So although I feel very privileged in my life to have counselors and social workers type people at my school, I know that a lot of kids don't have that same access, and I think we really overall want to try to target the problem before it even becomes one.
Yeah, Eve, you can go.
Oh, I was just going to add on to kind of what everyone said, that we all were very attracted to doing something in criminal justice and then kind of examining the different aspects. This just felt kind of the most close to home, I think, for most of us, because I know I rely on having people to talk to and different mentorship programs. And yeah, we were all just kind of interested in the mental health issue of it. And then when this kind of crisis started, we were all extra motivated to dive into this because it really exacerbates the mental health crisis for youth in our country.
For me, my reasoning was a little, I'm sorry you can't see me, my camera's broken, but my reasoning was a little bit different. I'm from the Bronx, so it's since middle school, I remember I've seen a bunch of my friends have run-ins with the police, get locked up, and it's you see these kids and they're great people, but it's they're struggling through so much and they have no outlet to release that in a sense. So it's there's no other system to turn to but the prison to school to pipeline system. So it's it just hits home because I know so many people are affected by this in my life.
I think there were two more questions that I saw, Mr. Umbach and Mr. Laub afterwards.
I want to echo Lucy's comments that this was a fabulous presentation. And so everything I'm about to say is definitely in the spirit of the loyal opposition. That is gaps.
We love the loyal opposition. Bring it on.
And the first is, while I was absolutely persuaded by your diagnosis of the problem, I thought you could have included more evidence that would persuade me about your solution. That is, there wasn't much there that social workers would improve circumstances. Everything you said was plausible, but there's a lot of research out there about whether or not social workers are going to be effective in the ways you described. And certainly there's a fair amount of evidence for disadvantaged populations that connection with social workers doesn't make much of a difference in terms of criminality. I'm thinking of the JRIP study with NYPD, where they connected at-risk public housing residents with any number of resources, and it turns out that their contact with the criminal justice system did not go down, even with extensive resources. If you compared them to similarly situated residents, there was no difference having a social worker. And so what I would want to see as loyal opposition is more evidence, not just that the problem is big, because we can all agree the problem is big, but that your solution is going to work. The next thing that I would suggest is in your process portion of your presentation, there's no component for evaluation. That is, you say we're going to do this, and then everything's going to be good. But there's nothing there that would persuade a funder it's going to be well spent, or that you would know that it's being well spent. And almost every funder is going to require evaluation. It's about 10% now of almost all grants. And we can all, debate whether or not evaluation is worthwhile, but certainly a funder is going to want to see that there's evaluation. And the third thing that I would point out is the larger context, which is that for the past 25 years, New York City has been sending fewer and fewer people to prison, right? That we have not, New York City as a location has not been adding to mass incarceration. And so while there's certainly a school to prison pipeline, it's an ever narrowing pipeline. The problem that you're describing is getting smaller. The loyal opposition, I want to say again, what a really fabulous and moving presentation, and technically beautiful. I thought the graphics were astounding. Whoever did the graphics, kudos.
Hey guys, I'd like to add on to what Fritz was saying. Thank you for that. If possible, do we have time? All right.
I think so. Yeah.
Oh, great.
Yeah, we have some time. Yeah. Yeah.
Not to be contrarian, but I do think we got to be careful when we're talking about school to prison pipeline versus general incarceration statistics. They're not the same, and so we shouldn't conflate them. The school to prison pipeline is, of course, about students who end up in our judicial system by nature of going to school, right? So the statistics about like Rikers and a shrinking population there do not necessarily suggest anything really about the school to prison pipeline overall. The data that I think is most relevant is when you look at what's actually provided by the NYPD, which you guys did do, and schools and the DOE that is, which tells us that the gap between students who face enforcement, who are arrested, who are handcuffed, who are considered mentally unstable, that there's a racial divide there. And I think that's really where the school to prison pipeline work matters, right? It's you can see that students, as the fellows were saying, you can see that students who have brown skin are just much more likely to to have judicial action taken against them for the same activities as their whiter counterparts. And so that's really the issue, I think, at hand here, and what we should focus on. So again, you guys did great. I think you've talked about some great stuff here. And you know what, Asher, I actually remember you in a debate last year on this issue. So I'm glad that it's still stuck with you. There was like a rainy Sunday, I believe, last year. I remember being in a room where you were arguing with students about this issue. So great to see that stay on your plate. The other thing I want to say is, I didn't hear much about our elected officials, or like our policymakers, and the role they have to play. As a policy wonk, I'm just going to say that is a place to explore as far as solutions, because they are ultimately the gatekeepers of the money, and how the extent to which policies are implemented, which ones are enforced and which ones are not. They have quite a bit of power there. And so, never forget that our council members and the mayor and our borough presidents in New York City do have quite a bit of sway over what kind of actions NYPD takes. Thank you.
Mr. Laub, I think you had a question.
Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
So thank you, and I just want to thank all the fellows. I also thought that this presentation is very compelling. I want to build off of the loyal opposition and say a couple things. One is, I would ask the group as a whole to really look at the origins of school discipline, particularly its connection to race from the outset. So the principal suspension is actually invented in New York City. It's invented in 1958, 18 months after the decision to integrate the schools, right? And so school discipline is rooted in racism in ways that we rarely look at historically, and we really need to think about, because we weren't even in a mindset to remove children from classes or remove children from schools until we were faced with the prospect of integrating the public schools in New York City. So one is, I think it's always important to go back to that history and kind of look at the ways in which race and school discipline are tied together. And then I'd point out that there's been a dramatic reduction in suspensions since 2011. In fact, by more than half in New York City public schools. And I think it's important to acknowledge the overall reduction in suspensions and arrests, but then still drill down on the disparities, right? And so you mentioned some of the key ones, ELL, special ed, right? What I was struck by was that you left out the way in which Black students are overrepresented in suspensions and arrests. And I think it's really, really important to lift up that racial component of the fact that those disparities seem to be so durable, and because I think it raises a lot of questions about what our next steps are in schools. And then this really speaks to then having a much more kind of surgical, if you will, idea about what skills you want social workers to bring to schools, right? And so there are social workers that are great at connecting people to other agencies and other partners in the community. They sort of navigate people getting extra help. That's kind of along the lines of suicide and mental health. But there's other social workers that really work on school culture within the climate of a particular school every day. And so that's a lot more about the ways in which adults interact with students and how low-level problems don't become much bigger problems, right? And it also speaks to the alternatives to exclusionary and punitive discipline. So I would sort of challenge you to be very clear that just because somebody graduates as a social worker doesn't mean that they're ready to be a social worker in a campus in the Bronx, right? That what a Bronx campus might need from a social worker that's really working on school climate and culture, that's a very specific skill set that I think you guys could drill down further on and be clearer, so that you're saying, we don't just need a social worker here. We need somebody who's coming with these skills and has the authority, right, to kind of change the plan, right? So for example, some schools have advisories, right? And that becomes a very critical place where students can talk about what's happening with them and checking in, right? Social workers can help a whole bunch of adults have those check-ins with young people in ways that are very meaningful and profound, and allow us to sort of identify problems when they're small before they become too big, right? And so I think that's, you know, something to pay attention to. So thank you for listening. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you all for your comments. And just to quickly, with the time remaining, address a few of the concerns. I think that obviously some sacrifices had to be made content-wise just to fit the time constraints. But in terms of the statistics we chose to highlight, we really did try to frame this more as more of an educational problem, that because there aren't social workers in schools, kids are not getting the education they deserve and are entitled to as public school students. So when we are saying things like schools that recently were given access to a social worker increased English proficiency rates and math proficiency rates by between 92 and 94%, what we're saying is that students get a better education and are able to kind of unlock their minds when there's a social worker present in that environment. And when we say that 98% of at-risk students move on to the next grade level if there's a social worker present in their environment, what we're saying is that 98% of those students aren't going to prison, are not being arrested. They're moving on, they're getting access to the education they deserve, and they're going to go into the workforce well-equipped and well-educated. So that's kind of the problem that we're trying to illustrate, that students are falling behind and resorting to crime instead of being well prepared to enter the workforce and become intelligent, workers.
Can I ask Patrick a question?
Actually, we're running out of time a bit, just because we're supposed to get this wrapped up by 2:55, unfortunately. And I know I got private messages for more questions, but if you have them, you can definitely email Sanda. Her email is on the rubric sheet, and she'll pass it on to the presenters, and they can get back to you as soon as they can. But I'd like to move on to introducing Jarrell Daniels, who I believe was you guys' partner for this, from the Center for Justice at Columbia University. So he's here and wants to speak and talk about his role and just what his organization does for a bit before we move back into the main room. Or maybe he's not here. I don't know. Presenters, do you know?
We haven't had contact with Jarrell for a little while. I think Sanda was organizing that with him.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, I guess that's great because then I know I saw a private message from a Kate Terenzi who said she'd like to ask a question if there was time. And so now I think maybe we have like 3 more minutes if she wants to ask her question, or anyone else has anything they really want to say before we go back.
Sure, I can ask quickly. So I really appreciated this presentation, and I especially appreciated part where you weren't shy about the cost of your proposal, and juxtaposed it to how much we spend on incarcerating people in the NYPD. Another data point on that is we spend almost $500 million a year just on the school safety division, and on criminalizing Black and brown young people. So I appreciated that a lot. And I was wondering, one of the things that when you went through the process, you talked about a number of points that you were checking with schools. One thing that I'd love to hear from all of you is how you think young people should be involved in making the solutions that you've talked about and evaluating them, especially Black and brown young people who are disproportionately impacted, right? Like 90% or so of arrests in schools are of Black and Latinx young people. So it'd be helpful to hear a little bit about what you think young people's role is in this process.
I mean, I think that students would play a big role in this mentorship program. I think by implementing like the mentorship program with the peer-to-peer, junior, senior to junior, like a middle school student to a high school student would be really good. I mean, that's something that I have in my school, and as a student body president, I implemented that because I believe that, for example, middle school freshmen and a high school freshman could relate because they're going through the same thing, just different level of work, what is being expected. But when you have that peer-to-peer relationship, is really good because you have that go-to person who you can go to instead of teachers. So especially from a transition, from going to a different school. So I think that would be really great. I think students would play a big role in our mentorship program.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Sorry. You can go.
Yeah, building on what Tamar said, like focusing it even more on like Black and brown students, I feel like using like the high school and middle school like partnership, like seeing an older person kind of like being a representation of like a good future in a sense, it like builds the sense of like I can do it too, so that middle school students just like them who are going through similar things like have that outlet and support from someone who's just like them.
And I also think that in terms of confidentiality and comfortability, like I know from personal experience, my school has a very similar program, and when I was going through middle school and the early grades of high school, felt way more comfortable discussing some more personal issues with a peer that's closer in age, felt less judged, or someone with similar characteristics and experience as compared to an adult.
I also think, just responding to the question, is like when we check back with schools, I think the main input we'd want to get, like other than I guess statistics, we'd want to get kind of feelings of the general student body and specifically like the Black and brown students. And I think that's who we're trying to help. So it would be most important to get feedback from them and not not just like school administration or anything.
Yeah. Sorry, I was just. Yeah.
No, go. I hate to cut conversation short, but Sandra wants us to finish at 2:55, but you go, and then we'll finish up.
All right, quick 10-second recap. Basically, it's a program for students by students. So what that means is that we want to make sure that all facets of the presentation work for the student body. So we want to encourage their voices to be heard. We want to listen to what they have to say, because what we don't want to do is create a proposal that students don't actually enjoy and claim that we're creating a youth-oriented proposal, but it doesn't actually benefit them. So at every stage along the way, we want to be checking in with as many students as possible.
Okay, so I'm getting a thing. It's going to kick me out of the room. So we're going to return to the main session. And at 3, we're going to resume with session 2, which is the new set of presentations. But in that interim time, there's a Kahoot happening in the main room. So if you want to do that, do that. If not, go take a break. No, totally up to you. But the next thing happens at 3, and it's kicking me out in 30 seconds. So.